Under cover of night in July 2019, a band of mercenaries fled across the Mediterranean. They were on the run from a Libyan warlord after a failed operation to take over the country.
If you want to conquer in the 21st century in an information age, you use mercenaries, special forces, things to keep war secret. And nobody's better at secret wars than mercenaries.
This is a world of duplicity and false stories and backstabbing. If you're a mercenary, you're essentially breaking the law in many countries. You're actually being told to find, locate, and murder people on the say-so of the person that's hiring you.
Among the team of private military operatives were 2 Australians who'd been recruited to take part in the botched operation. What do you think about the fact that there are Australians involved in this operation? Ex-military Australians?
It is exceptionally serious that former Australian military are applying the skills that have been granted to them by our community and our government for potentially criminal, certainly immoral things. That can't be allowed to stand.
This operation and the men behind it are now the subject of a United Nations investigation that provides a rare glimpse into the shadowy world of international guns for hire. Tonight on Four Corners, we investigate a covert mercenary operation to help overthrow a Middle Eastern government. We expose alarming new details about secret international deals and a program of targeted killings. We also reveal how it all went wrong for an Australian Top Gun and his Trump-connected boss. The story starts in the city of Amman, capital of the Kingdom of Jordan. On June 14 last year, an Australian man arrived in the city. According to UN investigators, he was there to oversee the purchase of helicopters and the transport of men and equipment into Libya to help overthrow the internationally recognised government.
This operation required buying used gunships, Little Birds, in Amman, Jordan. He was also shipping into Libya 3 Puma troop carriers and 3 Gazelle light helicopters, which can be modified to be gunships.
The Australian in Amman was a former Air Force fighter pilot called Christian Durant. He was the chief executive of a consulting firm headquartered in the United Arab Emirates called Lancaster 6. He's now a key focus of the UN investigation.
Christian Durant has been working for several years on a variety of efforts to supply private military contractors, both physically, bodies, humans, but especially helicopters, planes, drones, to various conflicts in mostly Africa, but to some extent also in the Middle East.
The project involved Lancaster and another UAE-based company. The operation was dubbed Opus, and according to a secret report, they advised the team can be effective within 7 days, with export of controlled items including helicopters, air ammunition, ground weapons, ground ammunition, and night vision.
You're literally asking to be arrested for planning what is essentially a coup. You're literally laying out a path for anybody who wants to investigate you.
The report concluded, Opus will continue their aggressive deployment program to support the commander's strategic intent. The commander was a Libyan warlord named Khalifa Haftar. Since 2014, he's been waging a brutal war to overthrow the Libyan government. His forces have been accused of serious human rights violations.
We have documented a horrific number of unlawful killings, or known as summary executions, of opposing fighters, where people are killed on the spot. In most cases, they're killed in a very gruesome way. And they are then paraded, very often even, in front of the cameras. But we have also documented cases of disappearances where people, even civilians, have disappeared. We do have concerns, obviously, in this atmosphere of complete impunity that these violations will just go on. There's currently zero cost for killing a human being in Libya.
In 2019, Haftar was besieging the Libyan capital, Tripoli, and the mercenary team in Amman was hired to help him in a final push to take the country. But the deal to buy Jordanian military helicopters fell through.
So, someone was deeply suspicious that there was something afoot in Amman, Jordan, with approximately 20 mercenaries, these aircraft that had just flown in and landed. So they shut it down. They blocked the sale of the aircraft. They froze the aircraft in place.
Scrambling to rescue the operation, they bought ex-military helicopters in South Africa. The choppers were photographed after being transported across the border into Botswana.
The people who were shipping those helicopters at the time were not declaring that they were going to be flying ultimately to Libya. They were intended to be modified once they got to Libya. And so, you know, the photos sort of give you some kind of paper trail of the movement of these helicopters from their starting point in South Africa to their endpoint in Benghazi.
Instead of stopping and pulling back and making sure everybody's safe and there's no problems, they proceed and they make it more dangerous, and they sort of double down.
On June 25, Durant left Jordan on the way home to the UAE. The mercenary team then travelled to Benghazi, Haftar's de facto capital in eastern Libya.
When they landed, they were handed phones that had been pre-programmed with phone numbers, and they were told to use these phones because they were secure.
Most of the men were ex-military and included 2 Australians. One was a former SAS trooper. The other was a former Army rifleman and Black Hawk crewman who was hired to be one of the Opus pilots.
Mercenaries allow anybody who can swipe a big paycheck to wage war. And mercenaries will follow the contract. They're not necessarily evil. That's how Hollywood depicts mercenaries. In truth, they're like fire. They can power a steam engine. They can burn your house down. They can do a humanitarian intervention and save civilians. They can commit human rights atrocities that their client won't or can't commit. Mercenaries are just an instrument. They're a tool.
Within hours of arriving in Benghazi, the whole operation fell apart when the leaders of the mercenary team went to meet the warlord. Robert Young Pelton has spoken to some of the people involved.
And they went to meet with the general, and the general, not seeing all his fancy gunships that he paid for, was furious at these men. There was 3 of them in the room with the general. And at that time, the general said, I paid $80 million, where's my stuff? And there were threats made against Durant's life. Now, obviously, there's a lot of emotion and yelling and whatever. So these men were escorted by an armed guard to a complex that had 2 homes, 2 houses, and it was very ramshackle. It wasn't well set up. And they had very little time to decide what to do.
With tension mounting, the team made the call to flee. As night fell, they headed to Benghazi port, climbed into 2 inflatable boats, and sped out into the Mediterranean. A few hours after dawn, the mercenaries entered the safe harbour of Malta's capital, Valletta. If they thought their troubles were behind them, they were wrong.
The 20 people arrived on a rib registered in Malta, named the Manta 1, and they entered our Grand Harbour.
Maltese police were alerted to the men's arrival.
Once they landed on shore, these 20 people that allegedly arrived from Libya, they were arrested immediately by the Malta police. They were escorted to the general headquarters here in Floriana. They were interrogated, investigated, and then later released.
From my understanding, they told the police that they were oil and gas workers doing a hyperspectral survey of some parts of Libya, and they had been evacuated because of fighting.
The men were released without charge and spent the night at a resort before leaving the island on international flights.
The investigations didn't stop there. The investigations continued.
This was off the scale. It was, I've never come across anything like it before. I mean, I've dealt with murders, I've dealt with criminals, international criminals being arrested in Malta, stuff like that, but nothing of this magnitude, nothing involving, heavy military hardware being channeled through a Maltese company and so on into a war zone.
The police learnt that the men had leased the boats from a well-known local businessman.
James Fenwick, who's the owner of Field Sports, which is basically the umbrella company which provided these boats. He's a Maltese businessman. He works in arms and ammunition transport logistics. He specialises in Africa. He's got quite a reputation apparently among in the private military community.
Police charged Fenwick and 4 of his employees with breaching European sanctions over the lease of the boats. When the case went to court, the Australian Christian Durant was named in Maltese media as a central figure in the plot.
Have you ever met Christian Durant?
Yes.
And did you speak to him in Malta when he was a resident here?
Yes.
Christian Durant is he's one of the senior members of Opus Group. He's a director of several companies there, and he was instrumental in the planning of bringing the aircraft, especially, into Libya.
Christian Durant epitomises the kind of men who inhabit this murky world. He sells his services in international conflicts as a private military contractor. He's spent his life chasing adrenaline-charged airborne adventures since his days as an Australian Air Force fighter pilot. Durant was dux of his fighter combat instructor course.
It's equivalent in many ways to things like Top Gun in America for Navy pilots. To be the dux of that course is to be recognised as and to become self-believing that you are in fact the best of those selected best. It means that they have achieved immense professional standing.
Durant wrote a book about his fighter pilot career using his military nickname, Surge. In it, he compared himself to the Tom Cruise character in the movie Top Gun. In a publicity interview, Durant expressed his frustration with having to play by the rules of the Australian military.
There was a lot of politics getting involved and senior bureaucrats getting involved that was eroding the force from what it was asked to do to defend the country. And I couldn't work in that environment. It clashed too much with my own personality.
After leaving the Air Force, Durant and an ex-fighter pilot friend started a seaplane business in Tasmania.
I knew him as Surge, a nickname he got, I think, in the military. My first impression of Surge was, here's a dynamic guy who is really interesting.
Another seaplane buff, Simon Current, ran the Tasmanian Tourism Industry Council. He helped Durant start his business.
He was an incredibly hard worker, unbelievably. He'd put in huge hours, I know. He would suck it up when the bureaucrats gave him crap, so to speak, which probably stemmed from his military training. He'd look at the problem, he'd sort it here, there and everywhere, and then he'd find a solution.
Durant was interviewed by the ABC at the time.
I've been involved with seaplanes in Canada, in America, and I think what Tasmania has to offer exceeds all of those.
What he didn't say was he was living a double life as a freelance military contractor.
Durant is a very familiar figure to me. A guy like Durant is not going to be happy working for, Singapore Airlines. He wants to be a warrior. He wants to be a leader, whether he's in a cockpit or not.
He was working in Afghanistan, providing aerial surveillance for Australian troops. He hinted at that in another ABC interview.
Now my meaning in my life is very much my family and the work that I'm doing overseas, which is some operational work for different governments overseas, which has very deep meaning, even more so than it had flying F-18s. So that's where I've found my reward now.
In early 2013, Durant and his family left Australia to set up a new life in the UAE.
The last I heard was that he'd gone to the Middle East.
And have you heard from him since?
No. No, I've never spoken to him since he left Tasmania.
Around this time, Durant met an American who was a major player in the world of mercenaries. Eric Prince is the US military's Dark Echo. A deeply conservative former US Navy SEAL, he's become one of the world's most high-profile and notorious mercenary bosses.
Eric Prince, it might be surprising to some of your viewers, is derided in the mercenary world. He's hated in the mercenary world because this is an industry that's all about staying under the radar. And here's a guy who constantly is seeking media attention, Fox News, with the president, getting in trouble with the Senate, getting in trouble with the New York Times.
Eric Prince created Blackwater, a private military company which became a byword for US lawlessness in Iraq. This is a leaked video made by Blackwater contractors, showing them running over and shooting at Iraqi civilians.
Oh my God! Oh my God!
What are you looking at, punk? You got a problem?
The company's darkest chapter came during a brutal incident in Baghdad's Nisour Square.
In 2007, a group of Blackwater unit, if you will, blew away 17 Iraqis in Baghdad, killed them. And this became a huge strategic, as they'd say in the Army, S-storm for the United States of America in the Middle East as they're launching a counterinsurgency campaign of winning hearts and minds.
Please raise your right hand. You promise to solemnly swear that the testimony you will give before this committee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Prince was hauled before Congress, but defended Blackwater's actions.
We strive for perfection. We try to drive towards the highest standards, but the fog of war and accidents and the bad guys just have to get lucky once.
I first met Eric Prince in 2004 at his headquarters in Virginia at Tyson's Corner because I was interviewing him for my book.
Robert Young Pelton saw Eric Prince's operation up close when he embedded with Blackwater in Iraq. They later fell out over a business deal.
I truly believe, as a moral human being, that Eric Prince is doing bad things. That's my belief, and I'm entitled to it. This is the thing that you will notice about Eric Prince, is everything he says makes sense up to a certain point, and you say, wait, you're talking about strangers flying into a country and just killing people. And you can't do that. I mean, you can do that, but you would go to jail, or you would kill the wrong people, or be shot at, or start a war. So he has this sort of 80% making sense and 20% scaring the shit out of you.
Blackwater eventually agreed to pay $42 million to the government for violations of arms trafficking rules. Prince left the US and began selling his paramilitary services to warlords and despots around the world.
What Prince has become is a hammer in which every problem is a nail. His solution is bring in foreign fighters, Western foreign fighters almost exclusively, into Islamic countries or countries in which, you know, the people who are going to be killed are Muslims, and that will bring peace and prosperity. I mean, it's an old concept. He didn't invent it. The idea is he will bring in, as the white knight, he'll swoop into your underdeveloped country, kill the savages and the bad guys.
In 2014, Prince set up a new company, Frontier Services Group. He asked an old friend, US Marine turned investment banker Greg Smith, to become its chief executive.
A lot of people advised me against going to work directly for Eric. More than a whole host of business, professional, and family friends said, "Are you sure you want to do this?" And I was, hell yeah, I want to do it. It's going to be exciting. We're going to start up a Pan-African logistics business. But I had plenty of warning from a lot of folks who knew Eric.
You have a tough job.
Frontier Services Group spooked itself in a corporate video.
Today, no matter how remote or unstable, no matter the risk level or how tough the environment, FSG gets the job done.
According to Greg Smith, the company was supposed to have no role providing military services.
Frontier ready.
In order for a U.S. citizen to really participate or lead defense services, you need a license from the State Department. And I thought, and I think Eric agreed, it was extraordinarily unlikely that the State Department was going to give Eric or any Eric-related entities a license to provide defense services anywhere in the world. And ultimately, we agreed that Frontier Services Group would be a pure logistics company. We would do logistics in remote places that were often dangerous. We would do them safely, but we would in no way be a security company or a PMC as Blackwater had been.
Prince recruited his friend, the Australian Christian Durant, known as Serge, to be Frontier's aviation specialist. Prince invited Durant for a day out on his yacht.
He arranged a day sail out on his Blackwater sailboat out of his villa in Abu Dhabi for me and Serge to meet each other along with a couple other folks. It struck me that they were, very close. I mean, when Serge showed up, he had his entire family. He hopped right on the boat like he'd been there before, and him and Eric were talking like they'd spent a lot of time together.
One of Prince and Durant's first projects was to secretly modify 2 crop dusters to carry weapons.
What we discovered is that the aircraft had been outfitted so that they could provide close air support, i.e. you could drop bombs from them and they could fire machine guns.
Soon after this, Durant left Frontier Services Group and set up a new company, Lancaster 6.
Literally within days of Serge's employment being terminated, as a matter of fact, we were probably still working out the agreement, we learned of a company called Lancaster 6 that had popped up. At that same time, Serge was using Eric's villa address in Abu Dhabi to receive communications from Frontier Services Group. So at that point, I just made the simple assumption that Serge and Eric had started up Lancaster 6 the moment that Serge left Frontier Services Group, or possibly earlier.
Lancaster 6 is fronted by Serge Durant, but is very closely linked to Eric Prince, and almost, it's not directly linked to Eric Prince on paper, but there is a track record of Eric Prince proposals in other parts of the world, like Afghanistan, where he proposes an idea and the solution is provided by and offered by a company called Lancaster 6.
Eric Prince is well connected to the Trump administration with strong ties to the Republican Party. He's become a permanent fixture in national security circles in Washington.
His sister is the Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos. So he has deep connections politically, financially, with this particular administration. You sort of think of him as being, under the Trump administration, a shadow Secretary of State or a shadow CIA director.
In the Mueller report, Prince was described as a trusted associate of the new administration. He was questioned over suspicions that a meeting with a Putin ally was an attempt to create a back channel between Trump and Russia.
He has had a very strong relationship with Steve Bannon, with Jared Kushner, with other members of the Trump White House. And that's the way he likes it. He likes to be sort of the gray agent, the guy that you don't really pay attention to.
In a radio interview with Steve Bannon, Eric Prince suggested resurrecting a Vietnam-era campaign of targeted assassinations of America's enemies.
It was a vicious but very effective kill-capture program in Vietnam that destroyed destroyed the Viet Cong as a military force. That's what needs to be done to the funders of Islamic terror. The main tumor of this problem is in Iraq and Syria, with other metastasis, other cancer cells, if you will, in the likes of Somalia and Libya.
He talked to me about his dream of what he called an army in a box, a private army of about 1,400 to 1,700 men with intelligence, aviation, combat capability, marine, aviation, and land forces that would be dropped into places like Rwanda, Darfur, and put down uprisings.
Supported by Durant's new company, and with allies in Washington, Prince went out selling his idea of an army in a box, a force of private contractors, vehicles, boats, and aircraft. One of his first pitches was to replace almost the entire US military in Afghanistan.
The idea that 6,500 guys with some crop dusters that were armed with machine guns could somehow turn around the graveyard of empires known as Afghanistan is absurd. But there are people in Washington who are eager to hear that message. Like, oh, we can do it in a year. Eric Prince, you seem credible somehow. We'll just do it. Even though generals laughed him out of the room.
Prince sold the plan in the US media.
Said we're not winning. The terrorist forces control almost half the country as it is now. So clearly this current strategy is not working.
Four Corners has obtained a document showing that at the same time, Durant's Lancaster 6 pitched an almost identical plan to provide air support to the Afghan military.
I think Durant does Eric's dirty work. It's what it appears to be. And Eric is smart enough to find people to do his dirty work for him. And if they get caught or it fails, I think he fully expects them either to clam up, take the heat, cash your check, and do what you're supposed to do.
I've come to sort of see that what Eric Prince has established as a business model is you use cutouts and proxies, lawyers, people to take ownership on paper of things while you have a secret verbal agreement or some other kind of secret side agreement that allows the sort of head of the organization, if you will, Mr. Prince, to control assets and direct operations.
In 2019 in Cairo, the mercenaries pitched Eric Prince's army in a box plan to Libyan warlord Khalifa Haftar. Four Corners has obtained the PowerPoint used to sell him on the project. It offered assault helicopters armed with heavy machine guns and rockets to carry out airstrikes on government forces, surveillance planes to identify and track targets, and a team of paramilitary special forces.
The idea was, let's use this army in a box, gunships, mercenaries, and push, be the tip of the spear type of thing.
The PowerPoint also contained a proposed find, fix, finish program, a US military term for targeted killings. The plan would use foreign mercenaries as an extraction termination team to kill or kidnap 9 of Haftar's enemies in Libya.
Normally, if you read a PowerPoint about being part of a military offensive in a place like Libya, it's a little concerning. But then when you're asked to assassinate a group of people, of which 2 are European citizens, you should be very worried, because now you're doing something completely different than just working for an army trying to, hone their skills or move them forward. You're actually being told to find, locate, and murder people on the say-so of the person that's hiring you.
Hi, Hussam. Hussam Najer is a Libyan-Irish citizen who fought to overthrow the 4-decade dictatorship in Libya. So, Hussam, I've seen a list created by a group of Western mercenaries. It's a list of Libyans that they're accused of planning to kidnap or kill for Khalifa Haftar. He was one of the men targeted for termination.
Well, I'm not aware of this document in particular, but if that's their motive, if their motive is we're cold-blooded killers, here's a hit list, kill this guy, you know, that's the end of it. I mean, if they are just cold-blooded killers, but then I have nothing to say to them, whether it be targeted as me, myself, or civilians as a whole. I think it's very important that the Australian population and country understand and know that one of their citizens is being implicated in these kind of actions.
When you privatize war, anything goes, right? So the laws of armed conflict, nobody cares about. Legitimacy, it's a punching bag of a word. Suddenly, laws of supply and demand replace laws of armed conflict. Ideology, patriotism, national security, it's only as good as you can afford it.
In the weeks after the mercenaries washed up in Malta, the United Nations ramped up its investigation into the failed operation. Evidence started to float to the surface. An inflatable boat abandoned by the mercenaries as they fled Libya was found near Benghazi.
When the UN began investigating, they started pulling sales, travel records, phone records, all these things, and everything started clicking together.
Both the UN and the Federal Bureau of Investigations is currently conducting an investigation into Eric Prince for alleged arms trafficking or working with General Haftar in Libya.
The investigation, run by the UN's panel of experts on Libya, has already gathered 140 pages of damning evidence about the Opus team. The panel found Christian Durant was in breach of a Libyan arms embargo for at least being complicit in the planning and execution of a military operation in support of Haftar.
There's an alphabet soup of nationalities, private military contractors and mercenaries on the ground in Libya. This is a very negative and unhelpful phenomenon in the Libyan conflict. And the bottom line is all of these countries, all of these forces need to take their hands off Libya. That's the way forward.
Even after the failure of the first operation, and with the UN investigation underway, Eric Prince sent a new team to Benghazi to try again in April this year.
Now, again, this story is being told by the people who were involved, and they were told to come to Dubai and just sit tight. And they were going to get paid, and everything would be fine, and there was going to be another go at it, and which happens.
Investigators believe the team were in Libya for a month and were again unable to carry out their mission.
You had two cracks at the taking over Tripoli and securing, obviously, one of the wealthiest countries in Africa, and it failed.
The panel's investigation will go to the UN Security Council's powerful Sanctions Committee, which will decide if Durant and others should receive asset freezes and travel bans.
I think all of the work of the panel is extremely important, but it's what is done with all of that. And when it hits the Sanctions Committee, what do the member states do? How are the violators of the arms embargo held accountable?
Four Corners can confirm the Australian government has the UN reports. If Durant is charged in Australia, he could face up to 10 years in jail and fines of $500,000.
It is exceptionally serious that former Australian military are applying the skills that have been granted to them by our community and our government for potentially criminal, certainly immoral things. In the way we control the threat of guns in our society by controlling the way guns are accessed, that perhaps should be something that should be considered about the way that military people are allowed to be employed.
If an Australian citizen takes up arms, provides military advice and services to overthrow a legitimate UN-represented government, also a Western-supported government, for profit, what's the next government? What's the next job? What's the next mission that they will concoct? That's how serious this question is.
Durant refused an interview, but told Four Corners in a statement, "We don't breach sanctions, we don't deliver military services, we don't carry guns, and we are not mercenaries." He also said the UN investigation is relying on false documents, and he remains friends with Eric Prince, but has no business relationship with him.
I think by going and digging all the way and not stopping on the investigation, it's likely that you can find out much more about the bigger sort of ecosystem of weapons smuggling and mercenary operations, not just in Libya, but everywhere on the African continent and in parts of the Middle East. So I think the Libya investigation is sort of it's like the tip of the iceberg.
If the UN sanctions Durant and the others, it will send a strong message to bands of mercenaries who profit from killing. If the UN doesn't act, it will embolden the shadowy world of guns for hire.
We're heading towards a world where military might is something you buy and sell in a marketplace, and it doesn't observe the laws of war, but the laws of economics. And now we're going to get to a point where warfare is no longer the exclusive domain of states. It'll be the domain of the global 0.01%, whether they're individuals or the Fortune 500. And that will change who has power in international relations as we know it.
The prospect of fighting in Libya also means that you become complicit in human rights abuses, and that you yourself, the fighters themselves, are responsible for very serious human rights violations. And even though currently the cost is zero and nobody's being held to account, but that will change at some point. At some point, there will be accountability, or so we hope.